My husband's affair partner did not just crash my daughter's 7th birthday party. She confidently strolled into our exclusive country club wearing a silk designer dress, carrying a luxury gift bag, and kissed him right in front of his corporate colleagues. She smiled at me fully, believing she held all the cards and had finally claimed him publicly. What she did not know was that as a forensic accountant, I had already tracked every stolen penny, and she was walking blindly into a financial trap that would cost them both everything. I am Claire, 33 years old, and somehow still amazed by the sheer arrogance of a woman who thinks sleeping with a married man makes her invincible. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground and smile while planning the ultimate legal revenge against those who betrayed you. The afternoon sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Oakwood Country Club ballroom. We were celebrating my daughter Lily turning 7. Children were running around the patio, completely oblivious to the adults mingling inside. It was supposed to be a flawless afternoon. Gavin, my husband of 8 years, was holding court near the open bar. He was a regional sales director for a massive tech firm, and he treated our daughter's birthday more like a networking event. He stood there in his crisp navy blazer, laughing loudly, surrounded by his vice president and several key clients he had invited to show off his perfect family man image. I was standing near the dessert table arranging the party favors when the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom swung open. The music playing over the speakers seemed to fade as a woman walked in. It was Sienna. She was 26 years old, Gavin's administrative assistant, and the woman he had been secretly sleeping with for the past 9 months. She did not try to blend in. She wore a striking emerald green silk wrap dress that was entirely inappropriate for a children's afternoon party. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. In her hands, she carried a sleek black luxury gift bag with a gold ribbon. I watched her with the calculated precision of someone who had spent the last 3 months gathering airtight evidence of their affair. Sienna bypassed the balloon arch. She bypassed the children getting their faces painted. She ignored the gift table meant for Lily. Instead, she locked eyes with Gavin from across the room and walked in a straight, deliberate line right toward him. The conversations around the bar began to die down. The tech executives, men who worked with Gavin and knew exactly who Sienna was in the office, stopped talking and stared. Gavin had his back to the doors. He was mid-sentence laughing at a joke his boss had just made when Sienna reached him. She placed a manicured hand squarely on his shoulder, turning him around. Before Gavin could even process her face, Sienna leaned in and kissed his cheek. It was not a brief, polite greeting. It was an intimate, lingering kiss right in front of his vice president. She smiled up at him, her voice perfectly clear in the sudden quiet of the room. "I brought you something special," she said, holding up the luxury bag. "You work so hard for everyone else. I wanted to make sure someone celebrated you today." The color completely drained from Gavin's face. His tan seemed to vanish, replaced by a sickening shade of pale gray. He looked frantically around the room, his eyes darting to his boss, then to his colleagues, and finally landing on me by the dessert table. Total panic set in. He grabbed Sienna by the elbow, his grip tight enough to make her wince, and pulled her a few steps away from the group. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice a furious whisper that carried clearly in the silent room. "I told you today was for Lily. You need to leave right now." Sienna yanked her arm out of his grasp. She did not look embarrassed at all. She looked defiant. She stood her ground, her chin raised, looking around the room as if assessing her new kingdom. "Why should I leave?" she countered loudly. "We are tired of hiding Gavin. You said yourself you were suffocating in this fake life. I belong here just as much as she does." Sienna pointed a sharp finger directly at me across the room. The guests gasped in unison. The clinking of glasses stopped completely. All eyes shifted from Sienna and Gavin directly to me. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to run out of the room or scream. I did none of those things. I simply wiped a smudge of frosting off my fingers with a napkin, took a deep breath, and prepared to burn his entire world down to the ground. I tossed the crumpled napkin onto the dessert table, my expression entirely unreadable. Gavin was still standing near the bar, his hand gripping Sienna by the arm, his eyes pleading with me silently from across the room. I knew that look. It was the look he used when he overspent on our joint accounts and needed me to fix the budget. He was silently begging me to sweep this massive humiliation under the rug, to usher this woman out the back door, and to save his precious corporate reputation in front of his boss and colleagues. I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the elevated platform where the hired entertainment was set up. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood, matching the steady, calm beating of my heart. I was not operating on anger. I was operating on cold, calculated precision. I bypassed the scattered groups of frozen guests, stepping up the 2 small stairs to the DJ booth. The young DJ wearing a polo shirt with the club logo looked absolutely terrified as I approached him. He had been playing an upbeat pop song, but his hands were hovering nervously over his mixing board. I leaned in and looked him dead in the eye. "Cut the music," I instructed quietly. He did not hesitate. He slid the master fader all the way down. The sudden silence in the massive ballroom was deafening. The upbeat bass was instantly replaced by the nervous shifting of feet, the clinking of ice in half-empty glasses, and the heavy, uncomfortable breathing of over 100 guests waiting for a disaster to unfold. I reached over the DJ console and unclipped the wireless microphone from its stand. I turned around to face the room. I held the microphone up and tapped the top of it twice with my index finger. Thud, thud. The sound echoed sharply through the high ceilings of the Oakwood Country Club, cutting through any remaining whispers. Every single face in the room turned directly toward me. I looked out over the sea of Gavin's coworkers, our supposed friends, and the country club elite. I found the vice president of sales, Gavin's direct boss, standing near a cocktail table with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed in deep concern. I found my mother-in-law, Brenda, sitting frozen at a table near the front. Finally, my eyes locked onto Sienna and Gavin. They were still standing near the bar, isolated now, as the guests around them had instinctively taken several steps back to avoid the blast zone. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and smoothly through the speakers. "Thank you all for joining us to celebrate Lily turning 7 today. She is currently having a wonderful time in the arcade room, completely unaware of what is happening out here, which is exactly how I planned it. As you can all see, we have had an unexpected arrival." I gestured with my free hand toward the woman in the emerald green silk dress. "I want to make sure everyone is properly introduced." I continued, my tone polite, but dripping with absolute ice. "For those of you who do not work at the regional office, please allow me to introduce Sienna. On paper, she is employed as Gavin's administrative assistant. She handles his schedule, his coffee orders, and his dry cleaning. However, she is clearly a highly dedicated employee who goes above and beyond her job description. In fact, for the last 9 months, she has also been functioning as his late-night assistant, hotel companion, and the primary recipient of his marital affection." A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. Someone in the back dropped a glass, the shattering sound echoing loudly, but nobody even turned to look at the mess. The vice president's jaw visibly tightened. Brenda covered her mouth with her hand. Gavin looked like he was going to vomit right there on the polished floor. I did not stay on the stage. I walked down the 2 steps, the microphone gripped firmly in my hand, and began a slow, deliberate march directly across the center of the room toward them. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. As I closed the distance, I saw Sienna's arrogant smirk begin to falter. The reality of standing in a room full of people who were judging her every breath was finally starting to penetrate her thick skin. She tried to maintain her posture, pulling her shoulders back and clutching the black luxury gift bag tightly to her chest like a shield. Gavin stepped forward, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Claire, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Stop this right now! You are making a scene. We can talk about this at home." I stepped smoothly around him, ignoring his presence entirely, and stopped just inches away from Sienna. I raised the microphone to my lips one more time. You walked into my daughter's party acting like you owned the place, I said, staring directly into her wide eyes. And you brought a gift. How incredibly thoughtful of you. Let us see exactly what you bought my husband to celebrate destroying a family. Before she could process my words, I reached out with lightning speed. I grabbed the thick gold ribbon handles of the black gift bag and yanked it out of her hands with a sharp, forceful tug. Sienna let out a startled squeak, her hands flying up defensively as I claimed the bag. I pulled the bag toward my chest, feeling the heavy, expensive weight of the box inside. Sienna immediately tried to lunge forward to grab it back, but Gavin clamped his hand down on her wrist, holding her in place. He was sweating profusely now, his tailored suit suddenly looking completely suffocating under the bright ballroom lights. I reached into the bag and pulled out a polished mahogany wooden box. The name printed in crisp gold lettering on the lid made a few of the older executives in the front row murmur in immediate recognition. Patek Philippe. I popped the brass latch and flipped the heavy lid open. Resting on a bed of cream-colored velvet was a stunning rose gold timepiece. It was an exquisite watch, the exact kind of status symbol men like Gavin obsessed over, but could never actually afford on a mid-level director salary. I held the open box up high, so the guests could see the polished metal catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. A $40,000 watch, I said, making sure my voice carried clearly through the microphone to every single corner of the ballroom. I turned my attention back to Sienna. She had recovered from the initial shock of me snatching the bag and had shifted right back into her defensive arrogance. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, jutting her chin out proudly as she glared at me. "Yes," she said, her voice loud enough for the quiet crowd to hear without needing a microphone. "He deserves it. Gavin works himself to the bone for this family, and he deserves a woman who actually appreciates his value. A woman who treats him like a king instead of just a walking paycheck." "You never appreciated him, Claire." I nodded slowly, allowing her bold words to hang in the tense, suffocating air of the country club. I closed the wooden watchbox with a sharp, echoing snap. "I completely agree with you, Sienna," I replied smoothly. "A man who works that hard certainly deserves to be treated like royalty. But there is a very strict legal difference between treating a man like a king and funding his lavish lifestyle with stolen money." Sienna rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Oh, please," she scoffed, shifting her weight onto one foot. "Do not try to act like you are the only one with money in this room. Just because you have your little accounting firm does not mean I cannot afford nice things for the man I love. I saved up my own corporate bonuses for that watch." I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had shown all afternoon, and it made Gavin physically take a large step backward. I did not argue with her. Instead, I looked over the heads of the crowd and caught the eye of the DJ. He was still standing frozen behind his mixing board, waiting for my specific cue. I gave him a curt, definitive nod. Behind me, covering the entire back wall of the ballroom, was a massive projection screen. For the first hour of the party, it had been displaying a looped video slideshow of Lily growing up. Smiling baby pictures, first steps, family vacations in the sun. The screen suddenly went pitch black. A second later, the projector flared back to life, flooding the darkened room with a stark, blinding white light. The image on the screen was no longer a picture of my beautiful daughter. It was a highly magnified, high-resolution scan of a monthly credit card statement. The entire crowd shifted forward, people leaning in and squinting to read the massive black numbers projected on the wall. I walked toward the screen and pointed up at the corporate header. "I run a forensic accounting firm," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority. "My entire career is built on tracking missing money, exposing financial fraud, and finding the exact paper trails that liars try so desperately to hide. Did you really think you could clone a corporate credit card from my own business without me noticing the massive discrepancy?" I walked the crowd through the financial document like I was presenting a major case to a federal grand jury. I pointed to a specific line item highlighted in bright neon yellow near the bottom of the bank statement. "Right there," I said, tracing the air beneath the massive text. A charge for $42,500 made exactly 3 days ago at the Patek Philippe boutique downtown. The card used for this transaction was a corporate platinum card registered directly to my accounting firm. A card that Gavin secretly cloned and handed over to you, Sienna, so you could play the role of the wealthy, generous girlfriend in front of his friends. The room erupted into completely shocked whispers. The vice president of sales took his glasses off, rubbing the bridge of his nose in sheer professional disbelief. Gavin was violently shaking his head, his hands raised in a pathetic attempt to deny the massive evidence projected on a 20-foot screen right behind him. Sienna looked at the glaring screen, then down at her manicured hands, the color finally draining from her cheeks as the brutal reality of the situation hit her. She had not just crashed a birthday party. She had just publicly confessed to possession of stolen property purchased through corporate credit card fraud. And I was just getting started. Gavin could see his entire professional and personal life disintegrating on that 20-foot screen. He lunged forward and grabbed the microphone from my hand. I let him take it. I actually wanted him to take it. I wanted the entire room to hear the exact pitch of his desperation. He let out a loud, forced chuckle that sounded completely hollow in the vast ballroom. He wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead and turned to face his colleagues, specifically making eye contact with his vice president in a desperate bid for male solidarity. "Look, everyone," Gavin said, his voice pitching an octave higher than normal. "I know exactly how this looks, but I promise you this is just a massive misunderstanding. Claire has been working herself to the absolute bone lately. You all know how stressful tax season is for accountants running their own firms. She has been pulling 80-hour weeks, barely sleeping, and honestly, the stress has made her a little paranoid. She sees financial conspiracies everywhere right now. She is just overworked and clearly not in her right mind today. We should really be getting her some help instead of staring at her." Gavin gestured weakly towards Sienna, who was still staring in horror at the giant bank statement projected on the wall. "Sienna is just my assistant," he continued, his tone dripping with fake sympathy and forced casualness. "She was simply running an errand for the regional office. That watch is a retirement gift for our senior director in Chicago. I asked her to pick it up and keep it safe until we fly out next week. She is literally just a corporate courier dropping off a company gift. Claire has completely misread the situation because she uses her forensic accounting skills to track my every move. It is a severe invasion of privacy, frankly born out of her extreme anxiety." He took a step closer to his colleagues, lowering his voice as if confiding in them, though the microphone broadcasted every single word across the room. "You guys know me," he pleaded, placing a hand over his heart. "I am a family man. I would never do something like this to my wife or my daughter." Claire has struggled with these delusions before. She gets these wild ideas in her head and twists completely normal business expenses into crazy accusations. The corporate card was just a mix-up with the billing department. A simple administrative error that my lovely but currently very confused wife has blown completely out of proportion in front of all our closest friends. Sienna whipped her head around to look at Gavin. The shock on her face was instantly replaced by a deep, fiery indignation. Just 2 minutes ago, they were the star-crossed lovers ready to conquer the world together. Now Gavin was publicly demoting her to a glorified delivery girl just to save his own skin. Her jaw literally dropped. She opened her mouth to argue to defend the romantic fantasy she had built in her head, but Gavin shot her a venomous, threatening glare that practically ordered her to shut up and play along with his desperate lie. I stood completely still, watching him dig his own grave deeper and deeper. Gaslighting is a fascinating defense mechanism to observe in real time. Instead of admitting fault, the narcissist will always try to convince the victim and everyone watching that the victim is actually losing their grip on reality. He was heavily banking on the tired old stereotype of the hysterical, jealous wife. He thought if he spoke with enough false confidence, his corporate buddies would rally around him and dismiss my hard evidence as a clerical error fueled by feminine emotion. The crowd, however, was not buying a single word of it. The vice president did not nod in agreement. He simply stared at Gavin with cold, hard, unblinking judgment. The numbers on the screen behind us were absolute. A forensic audit does not have anxiety. A bank statement does not suffer from paranoia or sleep deprivation. The date, the time, the exact dollar amount, and the vendor were all documented right there in high-resolution black and white. Gavin was flailing, throwing out desperate lies just to see what would stick, and it was entirely pathetic to witness. I did not raise my voice to interrupt him. I simply waited for him to run out of breath. When his nervous laughter finally died out and the heavy, suffocating silence returned to the ballroom, I took one deliberate step forward. I held my hand out, palm facing up, silently demanding the microphone back. Gavin hesitated, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the plastic handle. Under the intense scrutiny of 100 silent guests, he slowly handed it over. His chest was heaving. He had played his best card, the crazy wife defense, and it had failed spectacularly. Now it was time for the next phase of this very public, undeniable audit. I wrapped my fingers around the cool plastic of the microphone. I did not immediately raise it to speak. I simply let the crushing weight of Gavin's failure settle over the room. Before I could deliver my next piece of evidence, a harsh, grating voice shattered the quiet. "That is quite enough, Claire." The crowd parted once more. My mother-in-law, Brenda, marched forward. She wore her signature pearls and a tight, defensive scowl. Brenda was a woman who valued public perception above all else. She desperately maintained the illusion of old money wealth despite the fact that she was financially sinking. She stepped right beside Gavin, placing a protective maternal hand on his arm, and glared at me with absolute venom. "You should be deeply ashamed of yourself," she hissed, her voice loud enough to carry without any amplification. "Humiliating your husband in front of his respected colleagues. Ruining my granddaughter's beautiful birthday party just to stroke your own vindictive ego. You have always been a cold, calculating woman." I lowered the microphone slightly, giving her the floor. I wanted every single person in this country club to hear the exact twisted logic this family operated on. "Do not look at my son like he is some kind of monster," Brenda announced, turning slightly to address the staring guests. She then pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "If you want to know why Gavin sought comfort in someone else's arms, you only have to look in the mirror. You drove him to this." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "I drove him to commit corporate credit card fraud, Brenda," I asked calmly, my voice projecting evenly through the room. "You drove him away," she snapped back, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You are not a real wife. You are a machine. Even when you were 7 months pregnant with Lily, you were completely checked out of your marriage. Sitting at that dining room table until 2 in the morning, crunching numbers like a robot. You barely even looked at him. You never went to his company dinners. You never supported his networking. You just sat there staring at your spreadsheets while he was forced to attend important events all by himself. He was lonely. A man needs warmth, Claire. A man needs a woman who actually pays attention to him, not someone who treats her marriage like a sterile business transaction." Her words hung heavily in the air. A few of the older guests shifted uncomfortably. Brenda was playing the oldest, most misogynistic card in the deck. She was attempting to paint Sienna not as a homewrecker, but as a warm, available savior who had rescued her poor son from a frigid, unloving marriage. Sienna actually seemed to take courage from Brenda's defense. She stood up a little straighter, stepping closer to Gavin, trying to embody the supportive partner Brenda was describing. What Brenda conveniently left out of her dramatic speech was the harsh reality of our past. I let my mind flash back to those long nights she so viciously referenced. I remembered being heavily pregnant, my back aching constantly, my ankles swollen, staring at my laptop screen until my vision blurred. I was not working those insane 80-hour weeks because I loved spreadsheets more than my husband. I was working them because I was the sole breadwinner keeping a roof over our heads. While I was building my accounting firm from the ground up to secure our family's future, Gavin was out playing the big shot. The company dinners and networking events Brenda mentioned were actually lavish nights out at expensive steakhouses and high-stakes poker games. He was dropping thousands of dollars we did not have to impress people who did not care about him. He was out partying, living the life of a carefree bachelor, while his pregnant wife stayed home and desperately tried to untangle the massive financial disaster he was secretly creating. I carried the entire weight of our survival on my shoulders, while he played the victim. I looked at Brenda, feeling a deep, profound pity for her delusion. She had spent her entire life enabling Gavin's reckless behavior, making excuses for his massive failures, and blaming everyone else for his shortcomings. She was doing it right now in front of his boss and his peers, completely blind to the trap she was walking right into. So I said, slowly bringing the microphone back up to my mouth. The ballroom went dead silent again. You are saying that Gavin's infidelity is my fault because I worked too much during my third trimester, that I was a cold, absent wife because I spent all night crunching numbers. Yes, Brenda declared proudly, lifting her chin in defiance. Any real woman would have put her husband first. I nodded, a cold, sharp smile finally forming on my lips. Then I suppose we should talk about exactly what I was working so hard to pay for. Brenda blinked, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawing together in a rare moment of genuine confusion. She had expected me to cower, to cry, or to apologize for my supposed marital failures in front of her high society peers. Instead, I stood completely grounded, holding the microphone with the steady, unyielding hand of a woman who held all the receipts. I turned my gaze from Brenda to the rest of the room, specifically locating the table where several of her wealthy tennis-playing friends were seated watching us with wide eyes. I did not spend those nights crunching numbers because I wanted to avoid my husband. I stated clearly, my voice ringing with absolute certainty over the speakers. I spent those nights desperately trying to untangle a massive web of offshore accounts, maxed out credit cards, and hidden personal loans. While I was in my third trimester trying to prepare a nursery for our daughter and trying to keep my blood pressure down, I discovered that Gavin had secretly racked up $150,000 in sports betting debt. A collective intake of breath swept through the entire ballroom. Gavin physically recoiled as if I had reached out and struck him across the jaw. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another frantic lie, but the sheer naked terror in his eyes betrayed him instantly. He was not out networking with important clients to build a future for us. I continued, my eyes locking purposefully onto the vice president of sales. The executive was now staring at Gavin with overt disgust, clearly reevaluating every expense report Gavin had ever submitted. He was borrowing money we did not have to cover his massive losses. The bookies and creditors were threatening to put a lien on our family home. The home I had put the entire down payment on with my own savings. I worked myself to the bone, risking my own health and the health of my unborn child to bail him out of a financial hole that would have destroyed us completely. I then slowly turned my attention back to Brenda. Her jaw was tight, and the arrogant tilt of her chin had begun to waver. She glanced nervously toward her country club friends, sensing the immense danger her carefully crafted social image was now in. And since we are on the topic of my financial contributions to this family, I said, taking a deliberate step toward her. We should also discuss why I had to take on extra corporate clients the following year. You see, Brenda loves to entertain all of you here at the Oakwood Country Club. She loves to project the image of a comfortable, affluent matriarch who comes from old money. But 3 years ago, while she was busy criticizing my parenting skills and complaining about my work schedule, she was secretly facing total financial ruin. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying up to clutch her pearl necklace, as if she could choke the words back down my throat. "Do not you dare!" she hissed, her voice trembling with sudden raw panic. I ignored her completely and spoke directly to her horrified friends. 3 years ago, Brenda received a final notice of foreclosure on her beautiful Florida townhouse. She had defaulted on her mortgage for 8 consecutive months because she had blown through her savings trying to maintain a luxury lifestyle she could no longer actually afford. She came crying to my husband begging for a bailout. But of course Gavin had absolutely $0 to his name after his own gambling disaster. The silence in the ballroom was profound and heavy. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit above us, The elite members of the country club women who had just moments ago nodded sympathetically at Brenda's vicious defense of her son were now staring at her with wide, judgmental eyes. In their shallow world, nothing was more shameful than faking wealth and facing foreclosure. So who do you think paid the bank to stop that foreclosure? I asked the room, my tone laced with cold, biting sarcasm. Who do you think handed over the massive lump sum to save her precious vacation home from being auctioned off on the courthouse steps? It was not Gavin. And it certainly was not any of her wealthy friends. It was the cold, calculating robot who worked 80-hour weeks. I bailed out your son, Brenda, and then I bailed you out. I paid for the roof over your head. Brenda's face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of crimson. The fake wealthy facade she had spent decades meticulously building shattered into a million unfixable pieces right there on the polished hardwood floor. Her friends leaned away from her, whispering rapidly to one another. Sienna watched this entire exchange with mounting horror. The narrative she had been sold, the wealthy executive with the rich family, was crumbling before her eyes. She was not the prize-winning mistress of a powerful man. She was the side piece of a broke gambler. Desperation is a dangerous thing, and seeing Gavin lose all his power, Sienna decided to play the final, most desperate card she had. Sienna watched the absolute destruction of Brenda's social standing with wide, calculating eyes. She realized the wealthy, powerful family she thought she was marrying into was actually drowning in debt that I completely controlled. But instead of running for the exit like a rational person, Sienna doubled down. She was a woman who had invested 9 months into destroying a marriage, and she was not about to walk away empty-handed. She took a bold step forward, physically placing herself between me and Gavin. She lifted her chin, her emerald green dress shimmering under the bright chandeliers, and deliberately placed both of her hands flat over her stomach. The gesture was universal, and the collective intake of breath from the country club guests confirmed that everyone in the room knew exactly what she was about to say before she even opened her mouth. "You can wave your bank statements around all you want," Claire Sienna said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet arrogance. "You can brag about paying off debts and buying houses, but none of that matters anymore. Money cannot buy the one thing Gavin has always truly wanted. Money cannot buy him a real family." I stood silently, gripping the microphone, allowing her to dig her own grave in front of 100 witnesses. "I am pregnant," Sienna announced, projecting her voice so it echoed off the high ceilings. "And it is a boy. I am giving Gavin the son he has been begging for since the day you refused to have any more children." The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and outraged whispers. Several of the tech executives turned away in sheer disgust. Brenda, who had been staring at the floor in absolute humiliation just moments prior, suddenly snapped her head up. Her eyes darted to Sienna's stomach, a sudden, desperate glimmer of hope reigniting in her expression. A male heir. In her traditional twisted mindset, a grandson was the ultimate prize, a valid excuse for any amount of collateral damage. I shifted my gaze to Gavin. His initial reaction was genuine shock. His jaw dropped and he stared at Sienna as if he had never seen her before. She clearly had not told him this piece of news in private. But then, right before my eyes, the most predictable, sickening transformation occurred. The sheer terror of being exposed as a fraud melted away, instantly replaced by the overwhelming narcissistic pride of a man who believed his legacy was magically secured. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his navy blazer. He stepped up right beside Sienna and wrapped a protective, heavy arm around her waist. He actually smiled. It was a smug, self-righteous smile that made my blood run absolutely cold. "It is true," Gavin declared, leaning slightly toward the microphone in my hand. "We were going to wait to tell everyone, but Sienna is right. I am finally getting a son. A boy who can carry on my family name. Something you made very clear you were never going to give me, Claire." He looked out at the crowd, attempting to rally his colleagues once again. "A man needs a legacy," he reasoned, his tone sickeningly earnest. I love Lily, I really do, but every man wants a son to throw a baseball with, a boy to mold. Sienna is giving me a fresh start, a real future. Sienna smirked at me, radiating a toxic, triumphant energy. She genuinely believed this pregnancy was an impenetrable shield. You need to step aside, Claire, she commanded, stepping closer to me. The marriage is over. Gavin and I are starting our lives together. We need the family home. We need the space for the baby. It is time for you to pack your bags, take Lily, and leave quietly so Gavin can focus on his new family. You have your accounting firm. You will be fine. Let him be happy. She spoke with the absolute entitlement of a woman who thought she had just checkmated a grandmaster. She believed that parading a pregnancy in front of my face would break my spirit, force me into submission, and guarantee her a luxurious life in my $2 million home. She thought a baby was an automatic deed to my property. I did not shed a single tear. I did not drop the microphone. I looked at Gavin's smug face, and then at Sienna's triumphant smirk. I felt a profound, almost peaceful clarity. They had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. They had just publicly declared their intention to steal my assets to fund their new life. I smiled at her. It was a slow, predatory smile. You want the family home, Sienna? I asked calmly. She nodded confidently. It is only fair. Before I could deliver the crushing reality of her housing situation, a deep booming voice echoed from the back of the crowd, cutting through the tension like a massive steel blade. The booming voice that cut through the tension like a massive steel blade belonged to Gavin. In a sudden surge of adrenaline, he had stepped forward, completely abandoning his defensive posture. The sudden shift in his demeanor was jarring. Just minutes ago, he was a sweating, panicking mess, desperately trying to convince his vice president that I was suffering from a mental breakdown. But the public announcement of a male heir had completely rewired his brain. The nice guy act, the panicked husband routine, the desperate apologies, they all vanished instantly. In their place stood a man utterly intoxicated by his own perceived power and entitlement. He looked around the ballroom, no longer seeking approval from his corporate colleagues, but demanding their submission to his new reality. He reached out and pulled Sienna tightly against his side, a public claiming of his new prize. "We are done, Claire," Gavin announced, his voice echoing loudly off the crystal chandeliers. "I want a divorce. I am not hiding anymore, and I am not apologizing for choosing my own happiness." The sheer audacity of his statement sent a tangible shockwave through the room. He was standing at our daughter's 7th birthday party, surrounded by our closest friends and family, boldly declaring his infidelity as if it were a badge of absolute honor. He looked down at me with a mixture of pity and overt contempt. "You forced my hand." He continued, his tone shifting into the smooth, rehearsed cadence of a corporate boardroom negotiation. "You prioritized your spreadsheets over our marriage. You emasculated me at every single turn with your obsession with financial control. Sienna treats me with the respect a man truly deserves, and now she is giving me the son I have always wanted. So we are going to end this today cleanly and efficiently. You can keep playing the victim in front of everyone if it makes you feel better, but I am taking exactly what I am legally owed." I tilted my head slightly, watching his fragile ego inflate like a hot air balloon. "And what exactly do you think you are owed, Gavin?" I asked, my voice completely calm and devoid of the hysteria he so desperately wanted to provoke. He smirked, a cruel, highly satisfied expression that twisted his handsome features into something ugly and unrecognizable. First of all, he stated with booming confidence, "I am taking half of your accounting firm." A fresh wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Several of my own clients who were in attendance exchanged bewildered glances. I raised an eyebrow but did not interrupt his monologue. "You built that business during the course of our marriage?" Gavin lectured loudly, as if he were explaining basic arithmetic to a slow child. "That makes it a marital asset under state law. And let us be completely honest with everyone standing here today. You never would have landed half of your high-profile corporate accounts if I had not brought them to you through my extensive networking channels. I provided the social capital. I provided the emotional support while you worked those crazy late hours. I am legally entitled to 50% of its total valuation, and my legal team will make absolutely sure I get every single cent. Sienna nodded enthusiastically beside him, her eyes gleaming greedily at the prospect of cashing in on a successful firm she had absolutely nothing to do with. But he was far from finished. Gavin pointed a firm finger toward the hardwood floor, gesturing to the metaphorical foundation of our life. And then there is the family home, he declared. Our house is currently valued at over $2 million. Since Sienna and I are starting a brand new family and we have a son on the way, we are going to need proper space to raise him. I am forcing the immediate sale of the house. We will split the equity right down the middle. Sienna and I have already been looking at a beautiful 6-bedroom mansion in the northern suburbs. You and Lily can take your half of the cash and downsize to a nice condo closer to your downtown office. It makes the most logical, practical sense for everyone involved. He crossed his arms over his chest, standing tall, broad, and victorious. He had laid out his master plan in front of 100 silent witnesses, fully convinced that his rudimentary internet search understanding of divorce law made him invincible. He honestly believed that simply because he had decided to leave, he dictated the absolute terms of the surrender. He thought he could walk away from the burning wreckage of our marriage with a massive cash payout, a brand new obedient family, and a luxury suburban estate funded entirely by my decade of relentless hard work. He looked at me eagerly, expecting tears. He expected me to fall apart and beg him to reconsider his harsh terms. He wanted to break me publicly to assert his absolute dominance and walk out of that exclusive country club as the undeniable winner. Well, I stood perfectly still, letting his ridiculous, legally ignorant demands settle over the stunned crowd. I did not scream. I did not throw my microphone. I just smiled because the trap was fully set and he had just stepped perfectly into it. Gavin was waiting for my tears, but before I even had to open my mouth to dismantle his ridiculous fantasy, someone else decided to step into the ring. From the back of the silent ballroom, a slow, deliberate clapping began. The sharp sound of hands striking together echoed rhythmically, cutting through Gavin's triumphant aura. The crowd parted once more, and my brother-in-law Andre stepped forward. Andre was a 38-year-old African-American man who commanded respect the second he entered any room. He was married to my younger sister, but more importantly, for this exact moment, he was one of the most ruthless and highly sought-after corporate and divorce attorneys in the state. He walked with the relaxed, predatory grace of a man who spent his entire career destroying arrogant people in courtrooms. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal bespoke suit, adjusting his silver cufflinks casually as he strolled right up to the front of the crowd, stopping just a few feet away from Gavin and Sienna. That was quite a speech, Gavin Andre said, his deep, resonant voice carrying effortlessly without the need for a microphone. I give it an 8 out of 10 for sheer dramatic flair. But I have to give it an absolute 0 for legal accuracy. Gavin immediately stiffened. He had always been deeply intimidated by Andre. At family holiday gatherings, Gavin would constantly try to boast about his regional tech sales while Andre would simply nod politely, fully aware that his hourly billing rate was more than Gavin made in a month. Now, standing face to face in front of everyone, the power dynamic was undeniable and heavily skewed. "What are you doing, Andre?" Gavin snapped his voice, completely losing that booming confidence from a moment ago. "This is a private marital matter between me and Claire. You have absolutely no business stepping into this. Stay out of it." Andre chuckled, a rich, genuine sound that made Gavin flush with sudden anger. "Actually, Gavin, I have every business stepping into this," Andre replied smoothly, slipping one hand into his tailored trouser pocket. "You see, when you stand in a room full of country club guests and loudly declare your intention to seize half of my sister-in-law's corporate assets and force the sale of her home, it stops being a private family matter. It becomes a highly public declaration of financial intent. And since I am the lead legal counsel for Claire's accounting firm, not to mention her family, I feel a professional obligation to stop you from embarrassing yourself any further." Sienna glared at Andre, stepping even closer to Gavin's side, as if to physically shield him from the legal onslaught. "Gavin knows exactly what he is talking about," she interjected defensively, her voice shrill. "He is legally entitled to half of everything they built together. We are going to court, and we are going to win big. You cannot just intimidate us." Andre slowly turned his gaze to Sienna, looking at her with a mixture of pity and sheer professional boredom. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried the lethal weight of absolute legal authority. "Sienna, was it?" he asked politely. "I highly recommend you let the adults finish talking before you start spending money that simply does not exist." He turned his attention back to Gavin, his expression hardening into cold stone. "Gavin, my man, did you hit your head and suffer a severe bout of amnesia recently? Or did you genuinely forget the document you signed 8 years ago in my downtown office before you married Claire?" Gavin blinked, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face, before the panic started to aggressively set back in. "Document," he stammered desperately, trying to maintain his tough exterior in front of his colleagues. "We do not have any special documents. I never signed anything." Andre shook his head slowly, letting out a heavy sigh of mock disappointment. "I drafted it myself, Gavin. It was a masterpiece of asset protection, an ironclad airtight prenuptial agreement. And because I knew exactly what kind of opportunistic man you were even back then, I made absolutely sure to include a very specific, extremely aggressive infidelity clause." The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. A prenuptial agreement was the ultimate trump card in their wealthy circles, and hearing it deployed live was absolutely intoxicating for the crowd. "You willingly signed a legally binding contract stating that in the event of your proven adultery, you waive any and all rights to Claire's business assets, whether current or future," Andre explained, articulating every single syllable so there could be zero misunderstanding. "You also completely waived any claim to the primary residence, considering she provided the entire down payment prior to the marriage. If you cheat, you walk away with exactly what you brought into the marriage, which, if my memory serves me correctly, was a leased vehicle and a massive mountain of personal debt. You are not taking half of her firm, Gavin. You are not forcing the sale of her house. You are walking out of this marriage with absolutely nothing." The trap I had carefully set was finally springing shut. I watched Gavin silently process the devastating reality that his grand exit strategy was a complete and utter legal delusion. For a brief second, I actually thought Gavin was going to accept his defeat. The color had completely drained from his face when Andre mentioned the prenuptial agreement. He stood entirely motionless, blinking rapidly as the memory of signing that document 8 years ago finally pierced through his arrogant haze. But narcissists possess a terrifying ability to rewrite reality in real time to protect their own fragile egos. Instead of crumbling under the weight of his own mistakes, Gavin threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a forced, theatrical sound that grated against the ears and made several guests physically wince. He clapped his hands together slowly, mocking Andre with a condescending smirk. "You really almost had me there for a second," Andre Gavin said, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a highly imaginative toddler. "I will admit, you sounded very convincing with all that fancy legal jargon, but you are forgetting one massive glaring detail that completely destroys your little contract." Gavin took a heavy step forward, puffing his chest out to assert his physical dominance over the situation. He looked around at his tech colleagues, desperate to prove he was still the smartest and most powerful man in the room. "We live in a no-fault divorce state," Gavin announced proudly, emphasizing every single word as if he were dropping a brilliant legal revelation on a room full of amateurs. "I spent hours reading up on this online when I realized I needed to leave Claire. The courts here do not care who slept with who. They do not care about infidelity. The judge does not punish one spouse for finding happiness elsewhere." He turned his attention back to my brother-in-law, his upper lip curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. Those ancient infidelity clauses you try to stuff into contracts are completely unenforceable today. They get thrown out of court every single day by judges who actually know the law. So you can take your useless piece of paper and shove it because my affair changes absolutely nothing about the division of marital property. I am still getting my 50%. Gavin was practically vibrating with toxic confidence now. He felt absolutely invincible because he had skimmed a few legal blogs and decided he was fully equipped to go toe-to-toe with a seasoned litigator. But he was not done. He wanted to humiliate Andre publicly just as much as he wanted to hurt me. And honestly, Andre, I am not surprised you do not know how family law actually works. Gavin continued, his voice dripping with venom. You are nothing but a bottom-feeding lawyer who got lucky by marrying Claire's sister. You play dress-up in these expensive suits pretending to be some high-powered corporate bulldog, but we all know the truth. You are just a glorified paper pusher. If I actually need a real legal battle, I will hire a top-tier firm that will crush you before we even make it to a deposition. You do not scare me, and your fake little threats mean absolutely nothing to my bottom line. The room was completely silent, the tension so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Insulting a man like Andre to his face was professional suicide, but Gavin was too blinded by his own hubris to see the massive cliff he was sprinting toward. Seeing Gavin take control of the narrative, Sienna suddenly felt emboldened again. She stepped out from behind Gavin, wrapping both of her arms protectively around her stomach. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and triumph, fully ready to deliver what she believed was the final nail in my coffin. You are both arguing over a stupid piece of paper, while completely ignoring the most important factor in this entire situation, Sienna chimed in, her high-pitched voice echoing across the ballroom. The courts are not going to care about some dusty old contract when there is an innocent child involved. I am pregnant. Gavin and I are starting a real family, and family court judges always prioritize the well-being of the child. She reached out and grabbed Gavin's hand, holding it up like a championship trophy. The baby needs a stable home. She lectured us, looking around the room for validation from the shocked guests. The judge will absolutely mandate that Gavin gets the primary residence for child support purposes. They are not going to force a pregnant woman and a newborn baby into a cramped apartment while the bitter ex-wife gets to live in a $2 million house all by herself. That is just not how the law works. The baby changes everything. We are getting the house, Claire. You can fight it all you want, but the state will always side with the mother of his child. Sienna smiled broadly, thoroughly convinced that her reproductive status had just magically overridden every single property law in the country. She believed she had just presented an unbeatable legal argument. Gavin beamed down at her, clearly thrilled to have a partner who supported his delusions so fiercely. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of profound, staggering ignorance. I did not say a word. I simply turned my head and looked at Andre. My brother-in-law was staring at Gavin and Sienna with a look of absolute fascination, like a brilliant scientist observing a particularly stupid species of insect right before stepping on it. Andre did not shout. He did not need to. He simply took a slow, deliberate step closer to Gavin, closing the physical distance between them, until Gavin was forced to subtly tilt his head up to maintain eye contact. The sheer difference in their presence was undeniable. Gavin was sweating, his face flushed with the toxic combination of adrenaline and absolute ignorance, while Andre stood perfectly relaxed, an apex predator, examining a cornered mouse. Gavin Andre began, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying calm of a man who held all the executioner's tools. I am going to explain this to you very slowly, using very small words, so that even a man who gets his legal advice from a Google search can understand. Gavin's jaw clenched tightly. He crossed his arms defensively, trying to physically brace himself against the absolute dismantling that was about to happen. You are correct about exactly one thing, Andre said, holding up a single finger. We do live in a no-fault divorce state. That simply means Claire does not need to prove you are a cheating, lying, financially abusive husband just to file the initial paperwork. The court does not require a reason to dissolve the marriage. That is what no fault means. It is an administrative threshold, not a free pass to behave like a complete sociopath without consequence. Andre lowered his hand, his eyes locking onto Gavin's with intense, unyielding pressure. But what you conveniently failed to read in your frantic internet searches is the doctrine of dissipation of marital assets. Sienna frowned, looking frantically between Gavin and Andre. Dissipation, she echoed the word, sounding foreign and clunky in her mouth. Yes, dissipation. Andre confirmed, not taking his eyes off Gavin. It means that while the court does not care who you slept with, they care very deeply about how you funded that illicit activity. When a spouse takes money that belongs to the marriage, money meant for the mortgage, the groceries, or the child's future, and blows it on a secret second life, the court steps in aggressively. Andre turned his head slightly, projecting his voice so the vice president of sales and the other tech executives could hear every single devastating detail. Gavin here did not just take his mistress out for a few cheap dinners. He siphoned tens of thousands of dollars from joint marital accounts to pay for her luxury lifestyle. He bought designer bags, he paid for weekend getaways at five-star resorts, and worst of all, he stole a corporate credit card from Claire's accounting firm to purchase a $40,000 watch. Gavin opened his mouth to interrupt, a desperate denial forming on his lips, but Andre shut him down instantly with a sharp raised hand. Do not speak, Andre commanded. I am billing this verbal thrashing at $600 an hour, and I expect you to listen. Andre took a step toward Sienna, who instantly shrank back against Gavin's side. You claimed earlier that the court would give Gavin the family home because you are pregnant, Andre said, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at her audacity. Let me clarify how the math actually works in reality. Because Gavin deliberately wasted marital assets on his affair, the judge will legally mandate that he repays every single penny back to the marital estate before any division of property even begins. Andre paused, letting the heavy, crushing weight of that financial reality settle over them. You think you are walking away with $500,000 in equity from the house? Andre laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. By the time my legal team finishes calculating the total amount Gavin has stolen, embezzled, and dissipated over the last 2 years, his half of the equity will be completely wiped out just to cover his debt to Claire. He will be legally bankrupt before the divorce decree is even signed. Gavin's breathing became shallow and rapid. The smug confidence that had fueled his grand ultimatum was draining away rapidly, replaced by a cold, suffocating terror. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely devoid of arrogance. You are not taking half her firm. Andre continued, delivering the final crushing blows with surgical precision. You are not forcing the sale of the house. You are not taking custody of Lily because we have documented proof of your severe gambling addiction and financial instability. You are going to walk out of this marriage with the clothes on your back and a mountain of court-ordered debt that will garnish your wages for the next 20 years. Andre reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a sleek silver business card, and flicked it casually onto Gavin's chest. It fluttered to the floor, landing near Sienna's designer shoes. When you finally realize you need actual legal counsel instead of a blog post, Gavin, feel free to call my office, though I highly doubt you will be able to afford my retainer. The silver business card rested on the polished hardwood floor, catching the light from the chandeliers above. Gavin did not reach down to pick it up. He simply stared at it, his chest rising in rapid, shallow breaths. The bomb Andre dropped had shattered his illusion of control. He walked into this room believing he was a king, and now he realized he was nothing more than a debtor with a massive legal target on his back. I let him sit in that terrifying realization for a long moment before I turned my attention away from him. I shifted my gaze to the woman standing by his side. Sienna watched the exchange between Gavin and Andre with mounting panic. She waited for Gavin to step up to shout Andre down to prove he was the powerful executive she conquered. But Gavin was silent, thoroughly defeated. I took a deliberate step toward her, Tell me, Sienna. I asked, my voice calm, cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. How are you enjoying the view from that luxury downtown condo and the new white Mercedes SUV you parked by the front entrance today? Does it handle well on the highway? Sienna blinked, caught off guard by the sudden pivot. She looked at Gavin, then back at me. Her survival instinct kicked in, and she fell back on the only defense mechanism she had left: pure arrogance. She straightened her posture, pulling her shoulders back to accentuate her emerald silk dress. I love them, Sienna stated proudly, her voice echoing in the room. The view from the 30th floor is breathtaking, and the car drives like a dream. Gavin wanted to make sure I was comfortable. He wanted his son to grow up in a safe, high-end neighborhood. He bought me those things because he cares about providing for his family, something you clearly know nothing about. She smiled broadly, attempting to reclaim the high ground in front of the silent guests. She genuinely believed those luxury items validated her position. She thought they were physical proof that Gavin loved her more than he loved me. I nodded slowly, letting her boast hang in the tense air. Several of Gavin's co-workers were looking at each other in sheer disbelief. They knew Gavin's salary could not support a $2 million family home, a massive gambling debt, and a high-rise downtown penthouse all at once. Bought? I repeated the word, slowly tasting the ignorance in it. That is a very interesting choice of vocabulary, Sienna. It implies permanence. It implies your name is actually on a deed or a vehicle title. It implies actual ownership. Let me ask you a very simple question. Did you ever bother to read the paperwork when Gavin handed you those keys? Sienna frowned, the smug smile slipping from her face. What are you talking about? She demanded, crossing her arms defensively. Of course I own them. Gavin gave them to me. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. Gavin did not buy you anything, Sienna. Gavin does not have the credit score to buy a used bicycle, let alone a luxury penthouse in the financial district. His debt-to-income ratio is a complete disaster. If he asked a bank for a mortgage, they would laugh him right out the front door. Her eyes widened in complete shock. She looked at Gavin, waiting for him to furiously deny my claims, but he kept his eyes fixed on the floor, the sweat glistening on his forehead. So, if he could not secure a personal loan, how did he get you into that apartment? I asked rhetorically, pacing slowly so the room could hear the reality of her situation. Let me explain how it works. He used a corporate loophole. He used his position as a regional director to sign a commercial lease agreement. He registered a fake vendor account and used company funds to secure the deposit. That beautiful white Mercedes is not a romantic gift. It is registered as a corporate fleet vehicle under a subsidiary holding company. The color rapidly drained from Sienna's pale face. Her hands dropped from her stomach, hanging limply at her sides, as the wealthy fantasy she built her entire future upon began to evaporate. You do not own a single square foot of that apartment, I told her, my voice turning to ice. You do not own a single bolt of that car. You are completely at the mercy of a commercial lease that you did not sign and cannot afford to pay. You really thought you bagged a wealthy executive setting you up for life. But all he actually did was park you in a rented box using stolen corporate money. I let that devastating truth hang in the air for a moment, before I calmly unclasped my leather designer tote bag. The sharp click of the metal hardware was the only sound in the dead silent ballroom. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. It was not thick, but it carried enough legal weight to completely obliterate the new life Sienna thought she had secured. When you run a forensic accounting firm, you do not just stumble across missing funds and immediately start screaming at your husband, I said slowly, unwinding the red string closure of the envelope. You sit quietly, you pull the threads, you track every single digital footprint until you have mapped out the entire financial ecosystem. I found Gavin's fake vendor accounts 3 months ago. I watched him funnel his corporate bonus and the money he stole from my firm directly into a subsidiary holding company created solely to lease your apartment and your car. Sienna was staring at the manila envelope as if it were a live explosive. She took a tiny, involuntary step back. But I am not just an accountant. I continued pulling out two neatly stapled packets of paper. I am also a very aggressive investor. When I realized that the holding company holding your lease was practically insolvent due to Gavin's massive mismanagement of funds, I made a business decision. I used my own corporate capital to legally acquire that holding company. I bought the debt. I bought the assets. I bought the commercial lease agreements. I took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between us, and held out the first packet of paper directly toward her chest. "Take it," I ordered. Sienna hesitated, her hands visibly shaking before she slowly reached up and took the documents. Her eyes darted rapidly across the bold black text at the very top of the page. "As the new primary shareholder of the holding company, I am officially your landlord," I announced, ensuring my voice reached the back of the room where Gavin's boss was standing in stunned silence. "And because Gavin signed a commercial lease under false pretenses using stolen corporate funds, that lease is entirely null and void. What you are holding in your trembling hands right now is a formal 24-hour eviction notice." Sienna gasped, the paper crinkling sharply in her grip. "You cannot do this," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense pressure of her collapsing reality. "I am pregnant. You cannot throw a pregnant woman out on the street." "I can. And I just did," I replied smoothly, completely unfazed by her emotional manipulation. "The law is incredibly clear regarding fraudulent commercial leases. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your designer bags, your clothes, and whatever dignity you have left and vacate the premises. If you are still inside that apartment by tomorrow afternoon, the county sheriff will physically remove you for trespassing. The locks will be changed, and any remaining property will be seized to offset the massive debt your boyfriend owes me." I watched the fight completely drain out of her. The arrogant, triumphant mistress who had swaggered into this country club 30 minutes ago was gone. In her place stood a terrified 26-year-old woman who suddenly realized she had sacrificed her reputation for a man who owned absolutely nothing. But I was not quite finished. I held up the second piece of paper. "As for your transportation," I added, my tone turning brisk and businesslike. "Corporate fleet vehicles leased under fraudulent terms are subject to immediate recovery. The leasing agency was notified of the fraud early this morning." Sienna looked up from the eviction notice, her eyes wide with fresh panic. "My car," she stammered. "Not your car," I corrected her sharply. "The company's car, and it is equipped with a highly accurate GPS tracker. The repossession agents have already been dispatched. They are scheduled to tow that beautiful white Mercedes away exactly at midnight tonight. So if I were you, I would stop worrying about how you are going to decorate the nursery in my $2 million home and start figuring out how you are going to order an Uber to transport your belongings to a cheap motel." Gavin let out a choked, desperate sound. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. It was the look of a man who suddenly realized he had been sleeping next to a predator for months. He realized that every time I smiled at him over dinner, every time I asked him how his day was, I was actively and meticulously orchestrating his absolute financial ruin. He had thought he was the mastermind stringing two women along. He never realized he was just the mouse trapped in a maze I had custom built for him. The crushing reality of the eviction notice in Sienna's hands acted like a bucket of ice water thrown directly in her face. The united front they had so boldly paraded into the country club completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Sienna slowly lowered the piece of paper, her hands shaking so violently that the edges rattled. She did not look at me anymore. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto Gavin with a stare that could melt solid steel. "Is she telling the truth?" Sienna demanded. Her voice was no longer the arrogant theatrical projection she had used just moments ago. It was a sharp, dangerous hiss that carried perfectly across the quiet room. Gavin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. He looked frantically around the room, painfully aware that his vice president and his entire corporate team were watching this absolute meltdown with unblinking scrutiny. He took a hesitant step toward Sienna, reaching out with both hands in a placating gesture as if he were trying to calm a wild animal that was about to strike. Sienna, sweetheart, you need to lower your voice, Gavin whispered loudly, the sweat now visibly dripping down his temples and ruining his perfect hair. People are staring at us. We can figure all of this out later when we are alone. Let us just leave quietly. Sienna did not lower her voice. She stepped forward and forcefully shoved both of her hands against his chest, pushing him back. Do not tell me to lower my voice, she shrieked, the sound echoing harshly through the massive ballroom. Did you lease that apartment under a fake company name? Did you use stolen money to rent my car? Tell me right now, Gavin, are we being thrown out on the street tomorrow afternoon? Gavin stumbled back, his tailored suit jacket rumpling awkwardly. He threw a desperate, pleading look at his colleagues, but the men he had spent years drinking with and trying to impress were actively taking steps backward, physically distancing themselves from his toxic fallout. Finding no allies in the crowd, Gavin turned back to Sienna, shifting rapidly into the only survival mode he knew: the slick, fast-talking corporate salesman. Okay, listen to me, Gavin said, raising his hands again, his voice dropping into a smooth, practiced cadence. Claire is just playing dirty legal games because she is a bitter woman. Yes, technically the apartment is leased, but that does not matter in the long run. It is a temporary inconvenience. You know who I am. You know exactly what I bring to the table. I am the regional director of sales for one of the biggest tech firms in this entire state. Sienna let out a breathless, hysterical laugh. You are a director who does not even own the car he drives to work, she countered, waving the eviction notice directly in his sweating face. You lied to me for months. You promised me a luxury life, and now I am going to be completely homeless with a baby on the way. You are not going to be homeless. Gavin shot back, his voice rising in volume as his fragile ego took another direct public hit. He puffed his chest out desperately, trying to inflate his own worth in front of the silent, judging crowd. You are completely overreacting to a piece of paper. Do you have any idea how much money I make? My base salary alone is massive, and my executive stock options are scheduled to vest at the end of the next quarter. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure liquid cash just waiting for me. Sienna crossed her arms, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was looking at him not as her wealthy savior, but as a total stranger who had conned her into ruining her own life and reputation. We do not need that stupid downtown condo anyway. Gavin continued, pacing in a tight circle, speaking faster and faster as he tried to aggressively sell her on a future that did not exist. I told you I wanted a real family home. We will just accelerate the timeline. We will go to the bank first thing tomorrow morning. With my corporate income and my upcoming fourth quarter bonus structure, they will approve us for a jumbo mortgage in seconds. We will buy a brand new mansion in the northern suburbs, a massive house with a huge yard for the baby, an even better house than the one Claire is sitting in. Gavin paused, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, attempting to flash her a reassuring, confident smile that looked more like a grimace. This is just a bump in the road, Sienna. My income is more than enough to fix all of this by tomorrow afternoon. I am a top-tier earner. I can buy us anything we want. He was so deeply entrenched in his own corporate delusion that he actually believed his job was entirely secure. He thought this was merely a nasty domestic dispute that he could easily throw his future paychecks at to make it disappear. He had absolutely no idea that I had already severed his only remaining financial lifeline. Gavin was still desperately pitching his imaginary financial future, his hands waving frantically in the air as he tried to sell Sienna on stock options that were never going to materialize. Sienna was practically hyperventilating, the eviction notice clutched tightly against her chest, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an emergency exit. The spectacle had reached a level of absolute pathetic desperation that even Gavin's most loyal drinking buddies could no longer stomach. Several of them had actually turned their backs, pretending to be deeply fascinated by the floral arrangements on the cocktail tables. But there was one person in the room who absolutely refused to let Gavin sink. Brenda. My mother-in-law had been standing frozen near the front row, humiliated by my earlier revelation about her near foreclosure. But the sudden mention of her future grandson being thrown out onto the street snapped her completely out of her shame. In Brenda's traditional, deeply twisted worldview, a male heir was the ultimate currency. It was the only thing that could repair her family's tarnished legacy. She was not about to let a little thing like corporate fraud and a 24-hour eviction notice jeopardize her precious new grandchild. Brenda marched purposefully across the dance floor. She pushed past her son, completely ignoring his frantic rambling, and stepped directly in front of Sienna. With a dramatic, highly performative gesture meant for the entire country club to witness, Brenda wrapped her arms around the younger woman. She pulled Sienna into a tight maternal embrace, smoothing her hand down the back of Sienna's emerald green silk dress. Sienna initially stiffened, surprised by the sudden physical contact from the woman who had just minutes ago been fiercely defending my marriage. But desperation makes strange bedfellows. Sienna slowly leaned into the hug, letting out a shaky sob, willingly accepting the life raft Brenda was throwing her. "Do not, you cry, sweetheart," Brenda said, her voice loud and practically dripping with exaggerated maternal affection. "Do not you shed a single tear over this temporary nonsense. You are carrying my grandson. You are carrying the future of this family. I will absolutely not allow you to be treated this way. And I certainly will not let my grandson be born into instability just because of one bitter woman's vindictive legal games." Brenda pulled back slightly, gripping Sienna firmly by the shoulders and looking her directly in the eye. "You do not need that tiny leased apartment anyway," she declared, waving a manicured hand dismissively in my direction. "Let her have it. Let her keep her little pieces of paper. I have a much better solution. You and Gavin are going to pack your bags tonight, and you are going to fly down to my townhouse in Florida." Sienna sniffled, wiping a tear away carefully to avoid ruining her makeup. "Florida?" she echoed, a glimmer of hope finally returning to her eyes. "Yes, Florida," Brenda confirmed proudly, raising her chin. "My beautiful property in West Palm Beach. It is spacious, it is right on the water, and it is entirely ours. You can stay there as long as you need while Gavin sorts out this ridiculous financial mess. It will be the perfect place for you to relax, get away from all this toxic energy, and focus purely on a healthy pregnancy. The weather is gorgeous right now. It is a proper home for a growing family." Having secured her new alliance, Brenda slowly turned her attention back to me. The maternal warmth vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a scowl of pure, unfiltered hatred. She looked at me as if I were a pest that needed to be exterminated. "You really think you have won, do you not?" Brenda sneered, taking a step toward me to shield Gavin and Sienna. "You think because you understand spreadsheets and legal loopholes that you are somehow superior to us. You can take your eviction notices, you can take your corporate bank accounts and your cold hard money, but at the end of the day, Claire, you are going to end up completely alone in that big house of yours." She gestured broadly to her son and his mistress. "Gavin has something you will never understand. He has real family backing him up. We take care of our own. We protect our blood. When things get difficult, we do not throw our loved ones out on the street. We pull together. I am giving them my home because that is what a real mother does. You can try to strip him of his dignity, but you can never strip him of his family's support." Brenda crossed her arms over her chest, looking around at her country club friends with a triumphant, defiant glare. She had just publicly offered her most valuable asset to save her son. She felt like a martyr, a heroic matriarch stepping in to defeat the evil, calculating daughter-in-law. She genuinely believed her generous offer had checkmated my entire financial strategy. I did not interrupt her grand speech. I just stood there watching her dig a hole so incredibly deep that she would never, ever be able to climb out of it. I looked past Brenda and made eye contact with Andre. My brother-in-law was already shaking his head, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face as he reached for the sleek leather folio tucked under his arm. He knew exactly what was coming next. Andre let out a laugh that started low in his chest and quickly filled the silent ballroom. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, booming laugh of pure, unfiltered amusement. The sound completely shattered the dramatic tension Brenda had just tried to build with her self-righteous speech about family loyalty. Brenda snapped her mouth shut, her chest heaving with indignation as she glared at my brother-in-law. "I am so sorry," Andre said, holding up a hand as he struggled to compose himself. "I really did not want to interrupt this beautiful, touching movie moment you are having here, Brenda. The whole family pulling together in a time of crisis narrative is incredibly moving. Truly, it brings a tear to my eye. But unfortunately, I have a very strict professional policy against letting people commit real estate fraud in public." Andre reached into his sleek leather folio and pulled out a silver iPad. He tapped the screen a few times, his large fingers moving with practiced, deliberate speed. He walked at a leisurely pace across the dance floor, stopping right in front of Brenda, Gavin, and Sienna. The three of them stood frozen, a united front of sudden, intense anxiety. "You see, Brenda," Andre began, his tone shifting from amused to sharply professional. "When Claire told everyone that she bailed you out of your foreclosure 3 years ago, you made a massive, fundamentally flawed assumption. You assumed that because she is married to your son, she simply wrote a check to your bank out of the goodness of her heart and cleared your debt for free. You thought she gave you a gift. But Claire is not a charity. She is a forensic accountant, and more importantly, she is an incredibly shrewd investor." Brenda swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously down to the glowing screen of the tablet in Andre's hand. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, though her voice had lost all of its previous bravado. "It is my house. The bank sent me a letter saying the foreclosure proceedings were completely halted." Andre smiled, a sharp, merciless grin that showed perfectly straight white teeth. He flipped the iPad around and thrust it toward her face. "The foreclosure was halted because the debt was purchased," Andre explained, his voice projecting clearly so the entire crowd could hear the legal reality of the situation. "I want you to look right here at the public property records for Palm Beach County. I pulled them up this morning just to be thorough. Tell me, Brenda, who is listed as the primary lien holder on the deed of trust for that beautiful waterfront townhouse you just so generously offered to these two cheaters?" Brenda squinted at the screen. Her face, already pale from the earlier humiliation, suddenly turned the color of wet ash. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at the digital document in absolute paralyzing horror. Gavin leaned over his mother's shoulder, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. His breath hitched audibly. "Let me read it for the room," Andre offered, cheerfully pulling the tablet back. "The primary lien holder holding a debt of $280,000 is a private corporate entity, an entity of which my client Claire is the sole owner and operator. She did not pay off your mortgage, Brenda. She bought your distressed debt directly from the lender at a heavily negotiated discount. She did not save your house. She bought your house." Sienna let out a sharp gasp, stepping away from Brenda, as if the older woman had suddenly caught fire. The luxurious Florida escape she had just pictured in her mind vanished into thin air. "What exactly does that mean?" Sienna asked, her voice trembling with fresh panic. "It means," Andre said, turning his sharp gaze to the mistress, "that Brenda is not the wealthy matriarch she pretends to be. Legally speaking, Brenda is nothing more than Claire's tenant, and frankly, she is a terrible tenant. Because Brenda assumed the house was a gift, she has not made a single monthly mortgage payment to the new lien holder in over 36 months." Andre tapped the screen of his iPad, locking it with a sharp click before sliding it back into his leather folio. By all standard definitions of Florida real estate law, Brenda is currently a severely delinquent tenant residing on the property solely by the grace of Claire's endless patience. Andre continued, delivering the final fatal blow to Brenda's ego. "So, if Gavin and his pregnant girlfriend want to pack their bags and fly down to West Palm Beach tonight, they are more than welcome to do so. But they should know that Claire has had my office draft a formal notice of default and foreclosure on that property." Andre stepped back, giving them space to process the absolute devastation he had just unleashed. "If you try to move them into that townhouse, Brenda, you will not be hosting a family reunion. You will be hosting them in a house that the county sheriff will be auctioning off on the courthouse steps by the end of the month. So please tell us more about how the family is going to pull together to provide a stable home for the new baby." Brenda slowly raised her hands to her face, a quiet, broken sob escaping her lips. The grand illusion of her life was completely gone. She had nothing left to offer. She could not save her son, and she could not even save herself. The sound of Brenda sobbing quietly into her hands was the final trigger that broke Gavin completely. He watched his mother crumble, realizing that the Florida escape route was entirely gone. Every single exit door he tried to open had been slammed shut and locked from the outside. But instead of surrendering to the consequences of his own actions, Gavin reacted the way a cornered narcissistic animal always does. He went on the absolute offensive. His face, previously pale with panic, flushed a deep and angry crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He lunged forward, taking 2 aggressive steps toward me. Andre immediately shifted his weight, moving his large frame slightly to block Gavin's path, but Gavin ignored him completely. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. "You think you have won?" Gavin screamed, his voice cracking with the sheer force of his rage. The sound ripped through the quiet ballroom, causing several guests to physically flinch. "You think you can just stand there with your little spreadsheets and your real estate tricks and destroy my entire life?" I did not blink. I stood my ground, watching him unravel. "I am a regional director of sales," Gavin bellowed, pounding his fist against his own chest. "I bring in $50 million in revenue every single year for my company. I am an absolute powerhouse in the tech industry, and you are just a small-time accountant who pushes paper around in a strip mall office. You think you can bankrupt me. You think you can take my daughter and throw me out on the street just because you bought a few debts." He let out a deranged, bitter laugh, his eyes wild and unfocused. He swept his arm out, gesturing vaguely around the room as if rallying an invisible army to his defense. "My company values me too much to let some bitter, soon-to-be ex-wife ruin my life over a personal domestic dispute. They know exactly what I am worth to their bottom line. If you want a war, Claire, I will give you a war that will absolutely destroy you." He stepped closer, his chest heaving, his voice dropping into a vicious, threatening snarl. "You want to talk about legal power? My tech firm has a team of corporate bulldogs on retainer who eat local divorce lawyers like Andre for breakfast. I will take my case straight to my executives. I will tell them you are actively trying to sabotage their top earner. They will unleash a legal defense fund that you cannot even comprehend. I will drag this divorce out for decades." He was practically vibrating with toxic adrenaline, now fully believing his own delusional corporate fantasy. "I will file motion after motion," he threatened loudly. "I will delay every single deposition. I will bury your tiny accounting firm in so much corporate litigation that you will spend every penny you have just trying to respond to the paperwork. I will use my massive executive salary as a war chest, and I will starve you out until you are begging me to settle for pennies on the dollar." Sienna watched him from the sidelines, her eyes wide. She was desperately trying to cling to this sudden display of aggressive power, hoping against hope that his corporate threats were real and that he could actually protect her from the eviction. "You are nothing compared to the machine backing me up," Gavin shouted, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "I am an untouchable asset. You are just a jealous, vindictive woman who cannot handle the fact that I upgraded. My company will protect me because I make them rich. They will not let you take me down." It was a spectacular display of professional suicide. What Gavin failed to realize in his blind, screaming rage was that he was making these massive, bold claims right in front of the vice president of his region. I looked past Gavin's shoulder. The vice president was standing near the cocktail tables, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was not a picture of supportive corporate solidarity. It was a picture of absolute, unadulterated horror. Gavin was standing in a public venue screaming about using corporate legal assets to fight a personal divorce, actively dragging the company's name into his messy infidelity scandal. Gavin thought he was projecting strength. In reality, he was broadcasting massive liability to his employer. He was screaming that he was an untouchable asset, completely unaware that his boss was already mentally drafting his immediate termination paperwork right there in the country club. I let him scream until his throat was raw. I let him make every single threat outline, every single aggressive legal strategy, and boast about his massive, untouchable tech salary. When he finally ran out of breath, he stood there panting, his chest heaving, waiting for me to show a single ounce of fear. I did not show fear. I simply smiled, because his threats were built on a foundation that I had already legally demolished. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen once, illuminating a single text message I had received just moments before Gavin started his unhinged screaming match. I read the short confirmation text from my contact, locked the phone, and slipped it back into my pocket. I looked at Gavin, who was still standing defensively with his chest puffed out, waiting for my corporate surrender. "That is a truly impressive salary you have, Gavin," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the lingering echo of his shouting. $50 million in annual revenue for the region, executive stock options, a massive fourth-quarter bonus structure. You really have painted the picture of an irreplaceable corporate titan. Gavin sneered mistakenly, interpreting my calm acknowledgement as a sign of his victory. "Exactly," he snapped, adjusting his tie with a sharp, arrogant tug. "So I suggest you drop this entire eviction stunt, back off my mother's property, and let my lawyers draw up a fair settlement before I decide to completely crush you." I tilted my head slightly, studying his flushed, sweaty face. "It really is an incredible financial portfolio," I continued smoothly. "It is just an absolute shame that your entire compensation package is about to drop to zero." Gavin froze, his hands stalling midair. He dropped his arms back to his sides, his brow furrowing in deep, angry confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You see, Gavin," I explained, taking a slow, casual step toward the center of the dance floor, "you spent the last 5 minutes screaming about how I am just a small-time accountant who pushes paper around in a strip mall. You think my job is just balancing checkbooks and making sure small businesses file their quarterly taxes on time. You never actually took the time to understand what a forensic accountant does." I turned slightly, addressing the room, but specifically keeping the vice president of sales in my peripheral vision. "When a spouse suspects financial infidelity, they hire someone like me to look for hidden marital assets," I said, keeping my tone highly educational. "We look for secret bank accounts, hidden credit cards, and cash withdrawals meant to conceal a second life. That is the standard protocol." I turned back to Gavin, locking eyes with him. "But when I audited you, I did not just look for the money you stole from our joint accounts. I pulled the thread on every single digital transaction you have authorized over the last 24 months. A forensic accountant does not stop when they find the mistress's apartment lease. We follow the money until the trail completely ends. We find all the hidden money." Gavin's face went from flushed red to a sickly, translucent white. The aggressive corporate bulldog posture he had just been faking completely collapsed. He suddenly looked like a terrified child who had just realized the monster under the bed was entirely real. "You used your position as regional director to bypass standard internal audits," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute undeniable clarity. "You knew exactly which financial thresholds required a second signature from the executive board, and you deliberately kept your fake vendor invoices just a few $100s below that limit. It was actually a very clever, systematic approach. You submitted hundreds of microtransactions, classifying them as regional marketing expenses, client retention dinners, and software licensing fees. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Even Brenda had stopped her quiet sobbing, her head jerking up to stare at me in shock. Sienna looked completely lost, the corporate jargon flying over her head, but she could clearly see the sheer panic radiating from Gavin's rigid body. "You thought because you were the golden boy of the sales department, nobody would ever question your expense reports," I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "And you were right. Your company trusted you implicitly. They never looked twice at the paperwork you submitted. But when I discovered the holding company you set up to lease Sienna's downtown condo, I realized that the monthly rent was not coming from your personal checking account. It was coming directly from a vendor account registered to your employer. Gavin opened his mouth but no sound came out. His lips moved soundlessly, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. You did not just steal from me, Gavin, I concluded softly, delivering the final fatal blow. You stole from them, and when you steal from a multi-million-dollar tech corporation, they do not just fire you, they make an example out of you. The silence that followed my statement was absolute and suffocating. Gavin looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. His mouth was slightly open, but the arrogant corporate threats had completely dried up in his throat. I did not give him a single second to recover. I turned my body slightly so that I was addressing not just him, but the entire group of his tech colleagues gathered near the bar, including his highly attentive vice president. I want to explain exactly how sloppy you were, I said, making sure my voice carried a clinical detached authority. When I gained legal control of the holding company leasing Sienna's apartment, I naturally ran a full audit on its incoming cash flow. I expected to find your personal checking account. Instead, I found a tangled web of wire transfers originating directly from your employer's accounts payable department. Gavin took a weak step backward, his hands trembling at his sides. You created 4 separate shell companies. Over the last 2 years, I continued ticking them off on my fingers. You gave them names that sounded perfectly legitimate to a passing corporate auditor. Cloud Data Solutions, Synergy Software Integration, and 2 others. You set up fake vendor profiles in your company's procurement system. And then every single month for 24 solid months, you submitted fake invoices for non-existent software upgrades and phantom client relationship management tools. A collective gasp rippled through the group of tech executives. One of the senior account managers dropped his glass of bourbon onto a cocktail table, the liquid splashing over the edge, but he did not even look down. The vice president took a sharp, aggressive step forward, his eyes burning with a sudden, furious realization. You approved your own invoices, I stated clearly, laying the truth bare for his boss to hear. Because they were always just a few $100s under the executive review threshold, the automated accounting system paid them out directly to your shell companies. You essentially set up a permanent pipeline draining corporate funds right into your own pockets. The sheer scale of the theft hung heavily in the air. Gavin's colleagues were staring at him with absolute disgust. These were men and women who worked grueling hours to hit their quarterly quotas, and here was their regional director stealing the revenue right out from under them. And what did you do with all that stolen money? I asked rhetorically, pacing slowly back toward the center of the room. You did not invest it. You did not build a future. First, you used it to pay off the massive sports betting debts you accrued after I cut off your access to my personal funds. You were wiring corporate money directly to offshore gambling accounts just to keep your bookies from breaking your legs. I paused, letting my gaze drift over to Sienna. And once your gambling debts were temporarily satisfied, you found a new expensive hobby. You used the stolen corporate funds to fund a second life. You used it to lease the luxury downtown penthouse. You used it to lease the white Mercedes. You used it to buy expensive dinners, weekend hotel stays, and $40,000 Patek Philippe watches. You even used it to buy the emerald green silk dress Sienna is wearing right now. Sienna looked down at her dress as if it were suddenly crawling with venomous spiders. She took a frantic step away from Gavin, her hands hovering in the air. She realized that every single thing she thought was a symbol of his love and success was actually a piece of stolen evidence in a massive corporate fraud case. You are a thief, Gavin, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. A common, sloppy thief dressed up in a tailored suit. You spent years looking down on my accounting firm, completely unaware that the very skills you mocked were the exact tools I would use to dismantle your entire fake empire. Gavin finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He threw his hands up, shaking his head violently in a desperate, pathetic attempt at denial. It is a lie, he shouted, his voice cracking wildly. She is making all of this up to ruin me. I am the top earner. I would never do something like that. She faked the documents. He turned to his boss, his hands clasped together in a begging gesture. You have to believe me, he pleaded, the sweat pouring down his face. She is a bitter, crazy woman trying to sabotage my career. You know my numbers. You know my worth. But the vice president did not look at Gavin with sympathy or belief. He looked at Gavin with the cold, calculating fury of a corporate executive who had just realized his department was hemorrhaging money. The vice president did not say a word. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and stared at Gavin, as if Gavin were already a ghost. The vice president did not need to make a phone call to alert the authorities. He had already set the trap in motion before he even walked into the Oakwood Country Club this afternoon. As if responding to an unseen cue, the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom suddenly swung open with a resounding thud. Every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. It was not the catering staff bringing in Lily's birthday cake. It was two uniformed police officers. They stepped into the room with grim professional expressions, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. The low murmur of the crowd died instantly. The only sound in the massive ballroom was the heavy, synchronized thud of the officers' boots as they walked across the hardwood floor, heading straight toward the center of the room. The reality of the situation crashed down on Gavin like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling slightly, and he reached out to grip the edge of a cocktail table just to keep himself standing. Sienna pressed a trembling hand against her mouth, a muffled sob escaping her lips as the officers bypassed the stunned country club guests and stopped directly in front of Gavin. The vice president finally stepped away from the group of executives and walked over to join the police. He looked at Gavin, the mask of corporate professionalism completely gone, replaced by raw, absolute fury. He did not yell. He did not scream threats like Gavin had. He spoke with the chilling, measured precision of a man who was surgically removing a cancer from his organization. Are you? Gavin, one of the officers, asked, his voice deep and authoritative, carrying easily in the silent room. Gavin could not even manage a coherent word. He nodded weakly, his eyes darting frantically between the police, his boss, and me. He looked exactly like a man who was watching the entire structure of his life collapse into dust. Sir, the officer continued, unhooking a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding multiple counts of corporate wire fraud and felony embezzlement. I am going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. Gavin's face contorted in sheer panic. He looked desperately at his boss, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. You cannot do this, he pleaded, his voice a broken, raspy whisper. I am a regional director. I have an expense account. It was just an accounting error. I can pay it back. I will write a check right now. Do not do this to me in front of everyone. The vice president shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust crossing his face. You do not have the money to pay it back, Gavin, he said coldly. Claire sent me the complete forensic dossier 48 hours ago. We have spent the last 2 days verifying every single fake invoice and every single shell company you set up. The vice president took a step closer, towering over the broken man. You stole $450,000 from this company. You used our revenue to pay your bookies and fund an apartment for your mistress. Did you honestly think you were smart enough to hide nearly $500,000 in fraudulent expenses from an external audit? Gavin flinched as if he had been physically struck. He turned to me, his eyes wide with betrayal. You went to my boss. He gasped, the realization hitting him like a freight train. You gave them my records. I gave them the truth. I corrected him calmly, standing firm, while his entire world burned to the ground. You spent years telling me that I was just a boring accountant. You mocked my career. You told Sienna that you were the powerful earner. But the reality is, Gavin, you are nothing but a petty thief who got caught by the very woman he spent years underestimating. The second officer grabbed Gavin's right arm, twisting it firmly but professionally behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent ballroom was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable justice. Sienna let out a shrill scream, backing away until she bumped into Brenda. She was shaking violently, clutching her stomach, as if the police were going to arrest her unborn child. She looked at Gavin, the wealthy executive she thought she had conquered, now reduced to a handcuffed criminal sweating through his expensive suit. "I did not know," Sienna cried out, looking desperately at the vice president and the police officers. "I swear to God I did not know anything about fake invoices or stolen money. He told me he was rich. He told me he was buying me a house. I am innocent." I looked at Sienna, feeling a brief flash of pity, before the cold reality of her actions washed it away. She was not innocent. She was just as greedy and entitled as Gavin. She had just chosen the wrong horse to bet her future on. And she was about to learn that ignorance of the law was not a defense, especially when she was legally tied to a federal crime. The vice president did not even look at Sienna as she cried. He stepped past her, closing the final distance between himself and Gavin. The police officers held Gavin firmly in place, his arms pinned behind his back by the cold steel of the handcuffs. The executive looked down at the man he had once considered his top performer, his face a mask of absolute corporate hostility. "You really thought you were the smartest guy in the room," Gavin, the vice president, said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a sharp metallic edge that cut through the silence of the ballroom. "You thought you could treat our accounting department with the same arrogant disrespect you showed your wife. But you made a fatal miscalculation. You forgot that your wife is a professional who destroys financial criminals for a living." Gavin squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away, as if the physical act of looking away could make the nightmare stop. 48 hours ago, the vice president continued addressing both Gavin and the stunned audience of corporate peers. A secure courier arrived at the regional headquarters. He handed me a bound dossier compiled by Claire and her legal team. It was 300 pages long. It contained every single IP address you used to create those fake vendor profiles. It contained timestamps matching your secure corporate login to the exact moments those fraudulent invoices were generated. It even contained the routing numbers for the offshore accounts where you tried to hide the initial transfers. "I did it because of the pressure." Gavin choked out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "The sales quotas were too high. I had the gambling debts. I was going to pay it back after the fourth quarter bonuses paid out. I swear to you, I was going to balance the ledger." "You stole $450,000? The vice president snapped, his composure finally cracking to reveal his intense rage. "You do not balance a ledger after stealing nearly $500,000. You committed corporate wire fraud across state lines. You used our internal servers to embezzle funds from the operational budget." Gavin slumped forward, only kept upright by the firm grip of the two police officers. "Take my stock options," Gavin begged, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and streaming down his flushed cheeks. "Cancel my unvested shares. Liquidate my 401k plan. Just keep this internal. If you fire me, I can go somewhere else and pay you back every month. If you let the police take me, the company loses the money forever. Please just let me resign quietly." The vice president laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Resign quietly. Gavin, you are completely delusional. This is no longer a human resources issue. This is not a civil dispute or a messy divorce where you get to negotiate a settlement and walk away. You committed a massive federal crime. Our legal department contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission the second we verified Claire's documents." The mention of federal agencies sent a visible shockwave through the crowd of tech executives. The men and women who had been drinking expensive bourbon with Gavin just an hour ago were now taking physical steps backward, desperately trying to distance themselves from the blast zone. Several of them reached into their pockets, quietly pulling out their phones, likely deleting his contact information, and frantically reviewing their own department budgets. The board of directors held an emergency meeting yesterday morning. The vice president explained, his tone returning to that cold surgical precision. "You were officially terminated for cause effective immediately. Your stock options are voided. Your retirement accounts are frozen pending federal review. The company is pressing maximum criminal charges, and we will be fully cooperating with the federal prosecutors to ensure you serve real significant time in a federal penitentiary." Gavin let out a low, guttural moan. His legs completely gave out, and the officers had to hoist him up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing onto the polished hardwood floor. The arrogant, wealthy executive who had strutted into the Oakwood Country Club demanding half of my business and the sale of my $2 million home was entirely gone. He was nothing but an exposed criminal publicly stripped of his title, his income, and his freedom. I watched him hang his head, thoroughly destroyed by his own greed. He had wanted a war. He had threatened to use his massive corporate power to crush me. Instead, I had simply handed his own employer the exact weapons they needed to annihilate him. But while Gavin was drowning in the reality of his federal charges, there was one person in the room who had not yet realized she was going down with the ship. I turned my gaze back to Sienna. She was still clutching her stomach, looking at the police officers with wide, terrified eyes, completely unaware of the legal bomb I was about to drop directly into her lap. The two uniformed officers hauled Gavin firmly to his feet. He was completely dead weight, his expensive leather shoes dragging slightly against the polished hardwood floor. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs tightening around his wrists seemed to break the hypnotic trance that had paralyzed the rest of the room. As the officers adjusted their grip on his arms, the sheer terrifying reality of the situation finally breached Sienna's thick wall of denial. She took a sudden frantic step backward, her high heels catching slightly on the edge of the dance floor. She bumped hard into a cocktail table, sending a glass of ice water crashing to the ground, but she did not even glance down at the shattered glass. Her wide, panicked eyes were locked entirely on the police officers and the vice president. "I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this," Sienna cried out, her voice cracking into a high hysterical pitch. She threw her hands up in the air, physically distancing herself from the man she had just boldly claimed as her soulmate. "I am just his administrative assistant. I answer his phones. I organize his calendar. I fetch his coffee. I do not touch the billing software. I do not know anything about his expense reports or his vendor accounts." She looked wildly around the room, begging the silent crowd of tech executives for validation. "You all know me," she pleaded, her chest heaving under the emerald green silk dress. "You see me in the office. I just do what he tells me to do. I am completely innocent." When nobody in the crowd offered her a single word of support, Sienna grabbed her luxury black gift bag from a nearby chair and clutched it to her chest. She lifted her chin, attempting to summon a shred of the arrogant defiance she had worn when she first crashed the party. "I am leaving," Sienna announced, her voice trembling violently. "This is a highly toxic environment, and it is entirely too stressful for my baby. I am going home right now, and consider this my formal resignation from the company." She took 2 hurried steps toward the heavy oak double doors, desperate to escape the nightmare that had suddenly swallowed her luxury lifestyle. But I did not let her take a third step. I moved smoothly across the floor, positioning myself directly in her path. "You are not going anywhere, Sienna," I said, my voice low, steady, and completely devoid of sympathy. Walking away from an active crime scene is generally considered a very poor legal strategy, especially when you are the primary suspect. Sienna stopped dead in her tracks, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. "Suspect," she repeated, shaking her head aggressively. "Are you completely insane? I just told you I do not handle his money. I did not steal a single dime from that company." I folded my arms across my chest and looked at her with the clinical detachment of a professional auditor examining a highly flawed spreadsheet. "You really do not understand how corporate fraud works, do you?" I asked calmly. When Gavin decided to set up those 4 shell companies to siphon money out of the regional budget, he faced a massive logistical hurdle. He could not register the businesses under his own name. The internal automated auditing software would have immediately flagged an employee name matching a vendor payment. I took a slow step closer to her, forcing her to look me directly in the eye. And he certainly could not use my name, I continued. We are legally married. We file joint tax returns. Any sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of dollars into an LLC, registered to my social security number, would have triggered an immediate red flag with the IRS, and I would have caught him instantly. Sienna swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the handles of her bag. So what? She whispered, her voice barely audible. So he needed a ghost, I explained, projecting my voice so the vice president and the police officers could hear every single word. He needed a clean name. He needed someone completely disconnected from his marital financial profile, but someone deeply naive and blindly obedient enough to sign whatever legal paperwork he slid across a desk. I watched the exact moment the memory hit her. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, and the last remaining drop of color drained entirely from her face. She remembered the stacks of documents Gavin had brought to her apartment months ago. The papers he had hastily explained away as special tax write-offs for a confidential executive project. The dotted lines he had pointed to, urging her to just sign quickly so they could go out to a fancy dinner. The primary shell company, I stated, delivering the most lethal legal blow of the entire afternoon, the one that processed over $300,000 of the stolen corporate funds, is registered entirely in your name. Your signature is on the articles of incorporation filed with the state. Your social security number is firmly attached to the fraudulent business bank account. Sienna let out a choked, breathless gasp. She spun around to face Gavin, who was deliberately staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with her. "Tell them it was you," she screamed at him, her voice tearing through her throat. "Tell them you made me sign those papers." Gavin remained completely silent, a pathetic coward to the very bitter end. "You are not just his mistress," I told her, finalizing her absolute destruction. "Legally speaking, you are the chief executive officer of a fraudulent enterprise. You received stolen corporate funds directly into an account you own, and you used those exact funds to sign a commercial lease for your luxury apartment. You are not a bystander, Sienna. You are a legally documented co-conspirator to federal wire fraud and felony embezzlement." One of the police officers turned his attention away from Gavin and took a heavy, deliberate step towards Sienna. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, "I'm going to need you to drop the bag and place your hands behind your back. We have a warrant for your arrest as well." Sienna let out a shriek so piercing it physically hurt the ears of anyone standing nearby. She dropped the luxury black gift bag. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, the gold ribbon unraveling and the expensive $40,000 watch box spilling out near the toe of the officer's boot. She backed away, waving her hands frantically in front of her face as the officer advanced. I did not know she screamed, tears now streaming down her face, completely ruining her perfect makeup. "He tricked me. Gavin told me those were tax documents for a special project. He lied to me. I am pregnant. You cannot arrest a pregnant woman for something she did not even understand." The officer was entirely unmoved by her hysterics. He reached out, grabbed her wrist with practiced efficiency, and spun her around. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound echoed for a second time as he secured the handcuffs around her wrists. "Tell them," Gavin. Sienna sobbed, her voice breaking as the cold steel locked into place. "Tell them you used me. Tell them the baby and I have nothing to do with your stolen money." But Gavin did not look at her. He did not care about Sienna. He did not care about the baby she was carrying. In the face of his own absolute destruction, his toxic narcissism stripped away every fake layer of affection he had ever shown her. He was only concerned with saving himself. Gavin twisted awkwardly in the grip of the officers holding him, his face streaked with sweat and tears, and looked directly at his vice president. "Please," Gavin begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. "I have a family. I have a daughter. You know how much revenue I brought into this company over the years. You cannot let them put me in federal prison. I will do anything. I will wear a wire. I will testify against the bookies. I will give you everything I have. Just call off the federal charges." The vice president looked at him with an expression of pure frozen contempt. "You have absolutely nothing left to give, Gavin. he replied, his voice completely devoid of any human sympathy. "You are a liability, and my only job now is to surgically cut you out of this corporation." The officers began to march Gavin toward the heavy oak double doors. Beside him, the second officer was guiding a frantically sobbing Sienna, who was stumbling in her designer heels, her emerald green silk dress looking utterly ridiculous in the context of a federal arrest. As they were led away, my gaze shifted to the edge of the dance floor. My mother-in-law Brenda was standing completely frozen, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth. She had watched her golden boy, the son she believed could do absolutely no wrong, beg like a cornered rat and throw his pregnant mistress directly under the bus. The grand illusion of her life finally and permanently shattered. The realization crashed down on her all at once. Her son was not a wealthy, powerful executive. He was a federal criminal facing years behind bars. The Florida townhouse she loved so dearly was not a family asset. It was a foreclosed property owned by the daughter-in-law she had spent a decade treating like garbage. She had no money, no social standing, and now no family to protect her. Brenda let out a low, hollow gasp. Her knees buckled beneath her. She did not faint gracefully. She collapsed heavily into one of the folding chairs near the cocktail table. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs. None of her wealthy country club friends stepped forward to comfort her. They all turned their backs, entirely unwilling to be associated with such a spectacular public disgrace. She was entirely alone, left to drown in the massive ocean of debt and deception she had actively helped create. I stood in the center of the silent ballroom, watching the final pieces of their arrogant empire crumble into absolute dust. The guests were motionless, fully processing the staggering magnitude of the financial and legal execution they had just witnessed. Gavin had walked into this party fully expecting to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my business. Instead, he was being hauled out in chains, stripped of his freedom and his future. The sheer arrogance that drove him to flaunt his affair in public was the exact catalyst that guaranteed his ultimate downfall. He had built his entire life on a foundation of lies, manipulating everyone around him for his own selfish gain. But numbers do not lie, and the truth had just handed him a cold federal prison sentence. The heavy double doors of the Oakwood Country Club swung open one final time to let the police officers exit. Gavin was marched out first. His expensive Italian leather shoes squeaked awkwardly against the hardwood floor as he lost his footing, twice completely devoid of the swagger he had brought into the room just an hour earlier. He kept his head bowed, his chin practically touching his chest, unable to make eye contact with a single person he had invited to witness his grand victory. Behind him, Sienna was led out by the second officer. Her emerald green silk dress trailed along the floor, picking up dust and debris. She was no longer crying loudly. The sheer shock of the situation had seemingly paralyzed her vocal cords, leaving her staring blankly ahead as the terrifying reality of a federal holding cell loomed over her immediate future. The heavy doors closed behind them with a definitive hollow thud, sealing their fate. Inside the ballroom, the silence was thick enough to choke on. For a long moment, nobody moved. The country club elite, the tech executives, and our supposed mutual friends stood frozen like statues in a museum. Then a collective exhale swept through the room. The guests who had initially been shocked by my aggressive public confrontation now looked at me with an entirely new expression. It was a mixture of profound respect and genuine absolute terror. I had not just aired dirty laundry. I had surgically dismantled a dangerous fraud right in front of them. Several of Gavin's co-workers' men who had previously humored his arrogant stories nodded at me silently. They recognized that my forensic audit had ultimately stopped a massive financial bleed that could have jeopardized their own departmental budgets and year-end bonuses. I was no longer the crazy, overworked wife Gavin had tried to paint me as. I was the smartest person in the room. In the corner, Brenda remained slumped in her chair. Her quiet sobs were the only sounds disrupting the heavy quiet. Not a single person from her precious high society circle walked over to offer her a tissue or a comforting hand. The women she had played tennis with for years actively turned their shoulders away from her, sipping their drinks and pretending she did not exist. In their ruthless social hierarchy, financial ruin and federal criminal charges were highly contagious diseases, and Brenda was patient zero. She had banked her entire reputation on her son's fake success, and now she was left to pay the ultimate social price, completely alone. I felt no urge to comfort her. She had made her bed with cruelty and deception, and now she had to lie in it. Andre stepped forward, breaking the frozen tableau. He casually adjusted his charcoal suit jacket and walked over to where the vice president of sales was standing. The executive was still staring at the closed doors, his jaw tightly clenched as he mentally calculated the massive public relations nightmare his company was about to face. Andre reached into his breast pocket and produced another sleek silver business card. He extended it toward the vice president. "The corporate fallout from this is going to be incredibly messy," Andre said, his tone shifting back to the smooth professional cadence of a top-tier litigator. "When your corporate counsel needs to untangle the marital assets from the stolen company funds, have them call my direct line. I am handling the divorce proceedings, and Claire has authorized full transparency with your internal audit team. We want to make sure the company recovers what it is legally owed." The vice president looked at Andre, then looked down at the silver card. He took it, sliding it carefully into his own pocket. He gave Andre a firm, respectful nod. "I appreciate that," the vice president replied, his voice gruff but sincere. Then he looked across the floor directly at me. "And I appreciate you bringing this to us, Claire. You saved us from bleeding another $500,000 by the end of the fiscal year. If you ever want to leave private practice and head up a corporate risk management department, you let me know." I gave him a polite, tight smile, acknowledging the massive professional compliment, though I had absolutely no intention of ever working under a corporate umbrella again. With the legal and corporate business officially concluded, I turned my attention back to the physical space of the ballroom. Right in the middle of the dance floor sat the remnants of Gavin's destroyed fantasy. The crumpled black luxury gift bag, the unspooled gold ribbon, and the polished mahogany box containing the $40,000 Patek Philippe watch. It looked like trash left behind after a severe storm. I caught the eye of the country club's catering manager, who was hovering nervously near the kitchen doors. I raised my hand and gave him a sharp, clear signal. He hurried over immediately, accompanied by 2 staff members. "Could you please clear this mess off the floor?" I asked politely, pointing at the discarded items. "And please secure the watch box in the manager's office safe until the federal authorities come to collect it as evidence." The staff nodded quickly, sweeping the physical evidence of Sienna's presence into a bag. Within seconds, the floor was completely spotless again, the expensive debris whisked away as if it had never even existed. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the thick, toxic energy finally begin to dissipate from the massive ballroom. The air instantly felt lighter, cleaner, and entirely mine. The heavy burden of carrying the truth for 3 grueling months was finally lifted off my shoulders. I turned my gaze up to the DJ booth. The young man was still standing rigidly behind his soundboard, staring at me with wide, completely awestruck eyes. "You can turn the music back on now," I instructed him, my voice warm and genuinely relaxed for the first time all afternoon. "We have a birthday party to finish." The upbeat pop music flooded the ballroom once again, breaking the stiff, uncomfortable tension that had settled over the Oakwood Country Club. It was surreal how quickly the atmosphere shifted. The catering staff immediately resumed circulating with silver trays of appetizers, their faces carefully blank. The tech executives and country club members slowly drifted back toward the bar. Their voices kept to hushed, frantic whispers. They were actively dissecting every single moment of the spectacular downfall they had just witnessed. But whenever my gaze swept past them, they offered me polite, deeply respectful nods. Nobody dared to approach me. I had just demonstrated a level of calculated ruthlessness that terrified them, and that was exactly how I wanted it to remain. I did not need their fake sympathy. I only needed their absolute silence. I turned away from the main floor and walked down the long, carpeted hallway leading toward the children's entertainment wing. The heavy bass of the ballroom faded, replaced by the cheerful, chaotic electronic chiming of arcade cabinets. I pushed open the glass door and stepped into the dim, neon-lit room. It was an entirely different world. A dozen 7-year-olds were running frantically between air hockey tables and racing simulators, clutching massive handfuls of paper prize tickets. I spotted my daughter Lily standing on her tiptoes at the end of a glowing skee-ball lane. She rolled a wooden ball up the ramp, cheering loudly as it sank directly into the center ring. Our hired nanny was standing right beside her, holding a giant stuffed unicorn and clapping enthusiastically. Lily turned around and saw me standing by the door. Her face lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. She dropped her remaining arcade tokens and ran across the patterned carpet, throwing her arms around my waist. "Mommy, I got the high score," she announced proudly, her eyes shining. "Are we going to do the cake soon?" I knelt down, wrapping my arms tightly around her small shoulders, breathing in the sweet scent of vanilla frosting on her cheek. "Yes, sweetheart." I smiled, smoothing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "We are going to have the biggest piece of chocolate cake in just a few minutes. I just wanted to come see how many tickets you won." I looked up at the nanny and gave her a subtle, reassuring nod. She exhaled a quiet breath of relief, understanding instantly that the storm outside had passed and the perimeter was completely secure. Lily had not heard a single shout. She had not seen the police officers. She had no idea that her father had just been marched out of the building in federal handcuffs. She was completely insulated from his toxic destruction, safe and happy in the world I had meticulously protected for her. I stood back up, watching Lily sprint back to the skee-ball machine. As I leaned against the doorframe, a profound sense of peace washed over me. Society places a massive unfair burden on women when it comes to betrayal. When a husband cheats the world fully, expects the wife to completely fall apart. They expect us to scream in parking lots, to confront the mistress in public, to cry uncontrollably, and to fight desperately for a man who has already proven he is entirely worthless. The world loves a hysterical woman because she is easy to dismiss. But I chose a different path. The absolute sweetest revenge does not require raising your voice. It does not require pulling hair or throwing drinks in a crowded restaurant. True lasting revenge is simply weaponizing the truth. It is stepping back and allowing incredibly arrogant people to blindly trigger their own legal and financial execution. Gavin and Sienna thought they were untouchable because they believed their own lies. They thought their entitlement was a shield. But entitlement is actually a massive blind spot. It makes people sloppy. It makes them sign fraudulent commercial leases without reading the fine print. It makes them submit fake corporate invoices because they think they are smarter than the automated system. I did not destroy Gavin. I merely collected the receipts and handed them to the people he had stolen from. He built his own federal prison cell brick by brick, and I just happily provided the padlock. As for Brenda, she will spend the rest of her life living in the wreckage of her own shallow social climbing, evicted from her fake kingdom by the very woman she tried to banish. My accounting firm is thriving, my $2 million home is entirely legally secure, and most importantly, my daughter is safe from a man who viewed her as nothing more than a temporary prop for his corporate image. Tomorrow morning, Andre will file the divorce paperwork, and it will be the easiest legal victory of his entire career. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to outsmart a narcissist, or if you have ever used your own silent strength to build an airtight case against someone who underestimated you, I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories of surviving toxic relationships and taking back your power. Remember, you never have to play the role of the broken victim. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is smile, stay quiet, and let them destroy themselves. The most profound lesson to take away from the story of betrayal and retribution is that true power does not lie in how loudly you can scream, but in how meticulously you prepare your truth. When faced with ultimate disrespect, a spouse parading their infidelity and attempting to strip away your hard-earned livelihood, the natural human instinct is to react with explosive, uncontrollable emotion. Society often expects the wronged party to crumble into tears, beg for a rational explanation, or engage in a dramatic public shouting match. However, this story beautifully demonstrates that the ultimate defense against toxic narcissism is absolute emotional control backed by undeniable facts. Gavin and his mother thrived on fragile illusions. They built their confidence on fake wealth, assumed power, and the arrogant belief that they could easily manipulate the narrative. Their spectacular downfall was not brought about by a vicious emotional attack, but by the cold, hard reality of financial independence and strict legal boundaries. The protagonist taught us that knowing your worth isn't merely an emotional state. It is the practical application of protecting your assets, understanding your legal rights, and refusing to finance your own disrespect. Narcissists feed on chaotic emotional responses. By remaining completely silent during the discovery phase and strategically pulling the threads of the deception, the protagonist denied her abusers the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she allowed their own greed, entitlement, and ignorance to set the trap. She simply stepped aside and let the weight of their own actions crush them. It is an empowering reminder that undeniable facts will always outlast loud gaslighting. Take a moment today to review your own financial boundaries and ensure your independence is completely secure. Then share this story to empower someone who might be fighting a silent battle of their own.